The English Channel churned beneath the landing craft like something alive and malevolent, each wave slamming against the hull with enough force to rattle teeth and turn stomachs inside out. Waverly Woodson Jr. gripped the cold metal edge of the Higgins boat, his knuckles pale against his dark skin, and tried to focus on something other than the violent heaving in his gut. Around him, 30 other men from the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion clung to whatever they could reach, their faces gray-green in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944. The air reeked of salt spray, diesel fuel, and vomit. Someone was praying in a low, trembling voice. Another man was crying, though he tried to hide it by turning his face toward the spray. Woodson closed his eyes and thought of Joanne, his wife back in Philadelphia, the way she'd looked at him the day he shipped out, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. He'd promised her he'd come home. He intended to keep that promise. 5 minutes. The naval officer's shout barely carried over the roar of engines and the thunder of naval bombardment that had been shaking the sky since 4 in the morning. Somewhere ahead, through the fog and smoke, lay the coast of Normandy. Somewhere ahead lay a beach the planners had codenamed Omaha. Woodson was 21 years old, a corporal in the United States Army and a trained medic. He was also black, which meant that despite his medical training, despite his competence, despite everything he'd learned at Camp Tyson in Tennessee, he wore a uniform that marked him as separate, lesser, unequal. The 320th was a segregated unit, one of thousands in an army that reflected the brutal racial hierarchies of 1940s America. Black soldiers ate in separate mess halls, slept in separate barracks, and were commanded almost exclusively by white officers who often viewed them with contempt. The Barrage Balloon Battalion's mission was considered support work, not combat, though the distinction would prove meaningless in the chaos that awaited them. Their job was to deploy massive hydrogen-filled balloons tethered to the beach by steel cables, creating an aerial obstacle course that would force German aircraft to fly higher, making them easier targets for anti-aircraft fire and reducing the accuracy of their bombing runs. It was technical, necessary work that required training and courage, but it wasn't the kind of duty that made headlines or earned medals. Not if you were black, anyway. The boat surged forward, the engine screaming as the coxswain accelerated toward the beach. Through the gray dawn light, Woodson could now see the dark mass of the French coastline, obscured by enormous clouds of smoke from the naval bombardment. Shells from the battleships screamed overhead like freight trains, and the successive explosions lit the smoke from within, creating an apocalyptic landscape of fire and shadow. 30 seconds. Woodson's heart hammered against his ribs. His medical kit was strapped tight to his body, the canvas bag containing morphine syrettes, bandages, sulfa powder, plasma, and all the tools he'd need to keep men alive in the worst circumstances imaginable. During training, he'd practiced on dummies and in controlled exercises. He'd learned to work quickly, to prioritize injuries, to make impossible choices about who to treat first. But nothing, no amount of training, no lecture or drill could prepare a man for what was about to happen. The ramp dropped. For a single heartbeat, there was almost silence. A pause where the world seemed to draw breath. Then hell opened its mouth and swallowed them whole. The MG-42 machine guns opened fire from the German positions on the bluffs overlooking the beach. Their distinctive buzzsaw roar cutting through the morning air at 1,200 rounds per minute. The first men off the ramp were cut down instantly, their bodies jerking like marionettes before they toppled into the water. Mortar rounds began exploding in the surf, sending up enormous geysers of water mixed with sand and shrapnel. Go, go, go! Someone was screaming, but men were paralyzed with terror. Jamming up at the ramp, even as machine gun fire stitched across the boat's interior, Woodson forced himself to move, leaping into water that was chest-deep and shockingly cold. The weight of his equipment tried to drag him under. He pushed forward, fighting the tide, his boots slipping on the rocky bottom as bullets snapped through the air around him like angry hornets. The beach was carnage given form. Bodies floated in the surf, some face down, some staring sightlessly at the sky. Wounded men floundered in the water, crying for help, drowning under the weight of their own gear. The beach itself was littered with the wreckage of war-burning vehicles. Destroyed landing craft, tangles of barbed wire, and everywhere, the bodies of soldiers who would never go home. A mortar round exploded 20 feet to Woodson's left, and the concussion threw him sideways. His ears rang with a high, piercing whine that wouldn't stop. Shrapnel had torn through his uniform and embedded itself in his left thigh and buttock. Pain, white-hot and immediate, shot through his leg. He gasped, stumbled, went down on one knee in the surf. For a moment, everything slowed. He could see individual droplets of water suspended in the air, could see the smoke trails of tracer rounds drawing lines across the gray sky. Could see a young soldier, couldn't have been more than 19, crawling across the sand with his intestines trailing behind him like rope. The boy was screaming for his mother. Woodson pushed himself up. The pain in his leg was extraordinary, but it was distant somehow, separated from him by the adrenaline flooding his system. He could move. That was all that mattered. He could move, and men were dying. He reached the sea wall, a low barrier of wooden logs and stone that provided the only cover on the entire beach, and collapsed against it. Blood was soaking through his uniform trousers, warm and sticky. He needed to tend to his own wounds, but the screaming was everywhere. A chorus of agony that rose above even the sustained roar of gunfire. Medic, medic, the cry came from everywhere and nowhere, a desperate invocation repeated by dozens of voices. Woodson took 3 deep breaths, then pulled his medical kit around and started working on himself with hands that trembled only slightly. He cut away the fabric of his uniform, found the shrapnel wounds, 4 separate pieces of hot metal embedded in his flesh, and gritted his teeth as he poured sulfa powder directly into the torn tissue. The sulfanilamide would help prevent infection, though right now infection was the least of his worries. He wrapped pressure bandages around his thigh and his hip, pulled them tight enough to control the bleeding, and gave himself a shot of morphine. Then he stood up and went to work. The first man he reached was a white soldier from the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one. The man's right arm had been nearly severed by shrapnel, hanging by a few strips of muscle and skin. He was in shock, his lips blue, his eyes unfocused. Woodson pulled out a tourniquet, wrapped it high on the man's bicep, and twisted it tight with the windlass stick until the arterial bleeding stopped. The soldier screamed, then passed out. Woodson gave him a 1/4 grain of morphine, marked an M on his forehead with the man's own blood so other medics would know he'd been dosed, and moved on. The next was a sergeant with his jaw blown off. After him, private with sucking chest wounds on both sides of his torso. Woodson had to seal both holes with petroleum jelly gauze, his fingers working by feel and training while bullets continued to snap overhead. Then a kid from Brooklyn with both legs shattered below the knee. Then an officer with a piece of shrapnel lodged in his throat, choking on his own blood until Woodson managed to clear the airway and stabilize the wound. The morning became a blur of blood and screaming, of desperate triage decisions made in seconds. Every instinct in Woodson's body screamed at him to stay down, to hide behind the seawall and wait for the shooting to stop. But men were dying, and he was a medic. His duty was clear. He crawled across open sand under machine gun fire to reach wounded men. He dragged soldiers twice his size out of the water before they drowned. He worked with bullets kicking up sand inches from his face, with mortar rounds exploding close enough to shower him with debris, with his own wounds bleeding through their bandages and his leg threatening to collapse under him with every step. At one point, a German machine gun position on the bluff zeroed in on the section of beach where Woodson was working. The gunner walked his fire across the sand, systematically trying to kill the medic who kept pulling wounded men to safety. Woodson felt the rounds pass so close to his head that the pressure wave ruffled his hair. He dropped flat, his heart trying to pound its way out of his chest, and for the first time that day he wondered if he was going to die. But the fire shifted. Someone somewhere had taken out the machine gun nest, and Woodson got back up and kept working. 12 hours. For 12 consecutive hours, Waverly Woodson worked on that beach. He set up a makeshift aid station in a shallow depression near the seawall, and wounded men were brought to him in a steady, terrible stream. His hands became slick with other men's blood. His uniform was so saturated that it squelched when he moved. The morphine he'd given himself wore off, and the pain in his leg became a constant, grinding agony. But he couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. He performed a battlefield amputation on a lieutenant whose leg had been shattered by a direct mortar hit, using a tourniquet and a field knife because there was no time for anything else, and the man would die from shock and blood loss if Woodson didn't act immediately. He removed shrapnel from dozens of wounds, sewed torn flesh back together with needle and thread, pumped plasma into men who were white as paper from blood loss. He held dying men's hands and told them they were going to be okay. Lies whispered with such conviction that some of them died believing it. And through it all, through every moment of that endless day, Waverly Woodson was acutely aware of the color of his skin. The white soldiers he treated looked at him with surprise, sometimes with suspicion. A few refused his help at first, unable to reconcile the idea of a black man possessing the skill and authority to save their lives. One soldier, delirious with pain, called him a slur even as Woodson worked to stop the bleeding from his severed femoral artery. Woodson saved his life anyway. The white officers largely ignored him, directing wounded men to white medics when they were available, as if Woodson's presence was an afterthought. When he called for stretcher bearers, his requests were often overlooked until he raised his voice and insisted. The institutional racism that had shaped every day of his service didn't pause for D-Day. It was woven into the fabric of the Army as thoroughly as the stripes on the flag. But none of that mattered to the men who were bleeding out in the sand. When you're dying on a beach in Normandy, skin color becomes irrelevant. Pain and fear are great equalizers. And Waverly Woodson, black corporal from Philadelphia, son of a postal worker and a domestic servant, was the difference between life and death for more than 200 men that day. As the afternoon wore on and the initial chaos of the landing began to resolve into something resembling organization, Woodson's aid station became a focal point. Stretcher bearers knew where to bring the wounded. Other medics, recognizing his skill and his tireless dedication, began deferring to his judgment on complicated cases. White doctor from the 1st Infantry Division, overwhelmed by the sheer number of casualties, worked alongside Woodson for several hours and was heard to say, "That colored boy is the best medic I've ever seen." It was meant as a compliment in its way. It was also a reminder that even here, even in the midst of the greatest amphibious invasion in human history, even as men bled out in the sand crying for their mothers, the walls of segregation stood firm. Evening came, and with it, a reduction in the intensity of the German fire. The Allied forces had finally managed to establish a precarious foothold on the bluffs, and the immediate crisis of the landing had passed. The beach was still dangerous, still under intermittent artillery fire, but the worst was over. Waverly Woodson finally allowed himself to sit down. His leg had gone stiff, the wounds leaking blood despite the bandages. He was so exhausted that his hands shook uncontrollably. He'd gone through every bit of medical supplies in his kit and had requisitioned more from the aid station caches that had finally been brought ashore. He'd lost count of how many men he'd treated. 50? 100? More? A white sergeant approached him, a soldier Woodson had treated for shrapnel wounds earlier in the day. The man's right side was wrapped in bandages, his arm in a sling, but he was on his feet. "Corporal Woodson?" the sergeant said. Woodson looked up, too tired to be wary. "Sir, I just wanted to say ... single quotes." The sergeant paused, seemed to struggle with something. "You saved my life. You saved a lot of lives today. I don't know how you did it. I saw you out there running around under fire like the bullets couldn't touch you. I've never seen anything like it." Woodson didn't know what to say. He settled on, "Just doing my job, Sergeant." The sergeant nodded slowly. "Well, you did it damn well." He hesitated again, then added, "For what it's worth, I'm going to make sure people know what you did here today. You deserve recognition." "You deserve a medal." Woodson almost laughed, but he was too tired. Instead, he just nodded and said, "Thank you, Sergeant." The man walked away, and Woodson allowed himself to lie back in the sand, staring up at the sky that was beginning to darken toward night. Somewhere in the distance, artillery continued to rumble. Somewhere, men were still dying. But for this moment, Waverly Woodson allowed himself to close his eyes. He had kept his promise. He was still alive. And he had done what he'd been trained to do. He had saved lives. What he didn't know, couldn't know in that moment, was that the battle he'd just fought was only the beginning. The greater war, the one for recognition, for dignity, for justice, would last the rest of his life. In the days following D-Day, as the Allied forces consolidated their position in Normandy and began the bloody push inland, stories of heroism filtered back through the ranks. Eyewitness accounts were collected, after-action reports were filed, and recommendations for medals and commendations began to work their way through the military bureaucracy. Multiple white soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division submitted statements about Corporal Waverly Woodson's actions on Omaha Beach. They described in detail how he had worked for 12 hours straight despite his own wounds, how he had saved dozens, possibly hundreds of lives, how he had displayed courage and medical skill far beyond what anyone had expected. Several officers formally recommended him for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. The recommendations went up the chain of command, and then they disappeared. There was no official rejection, no explanation. The paperwork simply vanished into the administrative machinery of the segregated United States Army. Waverly Woodson received a Purple Heart for his wounds and a Bronze Star for meritorious service, respectable decorations. Certainly, but nothing approaching the recognition his actions warranted. Meanwhile, white soldiers who had performed similar acts of battlefield medicine on D-Day received higher honors. The disparity was not coincidental, it was systemic. The United States Army in 1944 was a deeply racist institution, reflecting the broader racial attitudes of American society. Despite the contributions of black soldiers in every American conflict since the Revolution, despite the proven courage and capability of African American troops, the military remained rigidly segregated. Black soldiers were largely relegated to support Rolls Quartermaster Company's transportation units, labor battalions. When they did serve in combat roles, they did so in segregated units under white command. The prevailing attitude among white military leadership was that black soldiers were inferior, fighting men less intelligent, less courageous, less capable of complex tasks. These beliefs were pseudoscientific racist nonsense, but they were nonetheless enshrined in military policy and practice. Black soldiers faced constant discrimination, both subtle and overt. They were passed over for promotions, denied opportunities for advancement, and subjected to degrading treatment that would have been unthinkable for white soldiers of equivalent rank and service. This discrimination extended to military decorations. A study conducted decades later would reveal that not a single black soldier received the Medal of Honor for service in World War II during the immediate post-war period. Despite the fact that African Americans served in large numbers and participated in some of the war's most brutal fighting, it wasn't that black soldiers hadn't performed acts worthy of the nation's highest honor. It was that the military establishment refused to recognize them. Waverly Woodson's case was emblematic by any objective standard. His actions on D-Day warranted the Medal of Honor. He had displayed conspicuous gallantry at the risk of his own life. He had gone above and beyond the call of duty under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. He had saved hundreds of lives. White medics who had done less received higher decorations. But Waverly Woodson was black, and in 1944 America. That fact alone was sufficient to deny him the recognition he deserved. The war continued, and Woodson with it. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion deployed their balloons on the beaches of Normandy, and the steel cables did their job, forcing German aircraft to fly higher and reducing the effectiveness of their attacks. The unit moved inland as the front advanced, setting up their balloons to protect bridges, supply depots, and other strategic positions. Woodson continued to serve as a medic, treating casualties as the brutal fighting dragged on through the summer and fall of 1944. He was there for the breakout from the hedgerows of Normandy, for the liberation of Paris, for the grinding advance toward the German border. He saw more death, treated more wounds, saved more lives. And through it all, he carried the invisible weight of serving in a segregated army that viewed him as inherently inferior. There were moments of dark absurdity. Black soldiers would fight and die to liberate French villagers, and the grateful French civilians would treat them with a respect and dignity they never received from their own officers. In Paris, French women would dance with black G's, and would invite them into their homes, would treat them as heroes, and white American officers would seethe with rage at the sight of racial barriers being transgressed. German prisoners of war, transported to POW camps in the United States, would sometimes eat in the same diners that refused to serve black American soldiers. The enemy was treated with more dignity than the men who wore the uniform. Woodson saw all of this, lived through all of this, and somehow maintained his commitment to his duty. He had joined the army believing in the promise of American ideals, even if American reality fell short. He believed that service and sacrifice would eventually be recognized, that excellence and dedication would transcend the barriers of race. It was a belief that would be tested over and over again. In April 1945, with Germany on the verge of collapse, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion was among the units that witnessed the end of the European War. Waverly Woodson was in Germany when news came that Hitler was dead, that the Third Reich had surrendered unconditionally. He was 22 years old. He had survived the war. He returned to the United States in the fall of 1945, one of millions of servicemen streaming home to a nation that was both triumphant and deeply troubled. Black veterans came back to a country where Jim Crow segregation still ruled the South, where lynching was still a reality, where the uniform they had worn counted for nothing against the color of their skin. Woodson married his sweetheart Joanne, started a family, and tried to build a normal life. He worked at the Veterans Administration, helping other veterans navigate the benefit system. He rarely spoke about D-Day, about Omaha Beach, about the day he saved more than 200 lives. When asked, he would offer terse, factual responses and then change the subject. It wasn't modesty exactly. It was something more complicated, a mixture of trauma, disappointment, and the hard-learned knowledge that his heroism would never be properly acknowledged. Why tell the story when the country had already decided to forget him? Decades passed. The World War II generation aged, and the veterans began to die off. D-Day became history, then memory, then mythology. Books were written, movies were made, monuments were erected. The Normandy American Cemetery became one of the most visited sites in France. Its rows of white crosses a solemn reminder of the cost of victory. But among those stories, among those monuments and memorials and commemorations, the contributions of black soldiers were largely erased. The heroism of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion went unmentioned. The name Waverly Woodson appeared in no histories, received no public recognition, sparked no national conversation about what he had done and what he had been denied. It was as if he had never been there at all. The civil rights movement brought some changes. President Truman desegregated the military in 1948, though full integration took years to implement. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 dismantled some of the legal structures of segregation. Black Americans won hard-fought victories in their struggle for equality, though the fight was far from over. In the 1990s, a comprehensive study was commissioned to examine whether racial discrimination had prevented black servicemen from receiving the Medal of Honor during World War II. The study reviewed thousands of records and identified several clear cases where black soldiers had been denied the nation's highest honor for actions that would have earned white soldiers the medal. In 1997, President Clinton awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 black World War II veterans, most of them posthumously. Waverly Woodson was not among them. His records, it seemed, had been lost or destroyed. The eyewitness accounts recommending him for the Medal of Honor had vanished into the archives. Without documentation, the bureaucracy could not act. Woodson himself was philosophical about it. By then he was an old man, a grandfather, someone who had made peace with his past, even if his country had not. When interviewed by researchers trying to document the contributions of black soldiers on D-Day, he spoke matter-of-factly about what he had done. He didn't sound bitter exactly. He sounded tired. "I did what I was trained to do," he said in one interview. "I helped people who needed help. That's what a medic does. The color of their skin didn't matter to me, and I didn't think about the color of mine. We were all just trying to survive." When asked about the Medal of Honor, about the recognition he had been denied, he shrugged. "I know what I did. The men I saved know what I did. That has to be enough. But it wasn't enough. It shouldn't have been enough." Waverly Bernard Woodson, Jr. died on August 12, 2005, at the age of 83. His death received no national attention. There were no headlines, no presidential statements, no memorials. He was buried with military honors as befitted a veteran, but the ceremony was small and private. The nation he had served, the nation he had bled for on a beach in Normandy, had forgotten him. But memory is a strange thing. History has a way of resurfacing, of demanding acknowledgement even decades after the fact. In the years following Woodson's death, historians and activists began to rediscover his story. Articles were written, documentaries were produced. His family, led by his son Waverly Woodson III, launched a campaign to have their father posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The eyewitness accounts were tracked down in archives. The after-action reports were located. The full scope of what Waverly Woodson had done on D-Day was pieced together from fragmentary records and the fading memories of surviving veterans. The case was airtight by any reasonable standard. Woodson had more than earned the Medal of Honor, but the bureaucracy moved slowly, if it moved at all. The Army's position was that without the original recommendations in the official record, they could not retroactively award the medal. The fact that those recommendations had been lost specifically because of institutional racism was apparently irrelevant. In 2015, 71 years after D-Day, members of Congress introduced legislation to grant Waverly Woodson the Medal of Honor. The bill had bipartisan support. Testimonials were entered into the congressional record detailing Woodson's heroism. Veterans organizations endorsed the effort. It seemed, finally, that justice might be done. The bill languished in committee and died without a vote. Another attempt was made in 2019. Again, the legislation failed to advance. The reasons were bureaucratic, procedural, political, a dozen different excuses that all amounted to the same thing. America still wasn't ready to fully acknowledge what it had done to its black veterans. Still wasn't ready to admit that racism had shaped not just the daily indignities of segregated military service, but also the highest honors the nation could bestow. As of 2025, Waverly Woodson has still not received the Medal of Honor. His family continues to advocate for recognition. Historians continue to document his story. But the official record remains unchanged, a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. Respectable medals that fall far short of what he earned. The story of Waverly Woodson is not just about one man's heroism, though his heroism was extraordinary. It is about the invisible costs of systemic racism, about the erasure of black contributions to American history, about the ways that institutional discrimination echoes across generations. When we remember D-Day, we remember the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc, the paratroopers scattered across the Normandy countryside. The G is wading through the surf at Omaha Beach. We remember the white faces of the greatest generation, the men who are lionized in movies and memorials and presidential speeches. We rarely remember that black soldiers were there too. We forget about the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, the men who deployed the barrage balloons under fire and who fought when fighting was necessary despite the fact that they weren't officially combat troops. We forget about the black quartermaster companies who kept the supplies flowing, the black engineers who built the bridges, the black medics who saved lives without regard for the color of the skin of the wounded. We forget because it's easier to forget. Because acknowledging the full truth requires acknowledging uncomfortable realities about American history, about the gap between American ideals and American practice. It requires admitting that even in our finest hour, even in the war against fascism and genocide, we maintained a system of racial apartheid within our own military. Waverly Woodson's story exposes those contradictions. Here was a man who displayed the highest form of courage, who embodied the best of American ideals, self-sacrifice, duty, compassion, and who was denied recognition specifically because of his race. His heroism could not overcome the color of his skin. His service could not transcend the barriers of segregation, and so he was forgotten deliberately and systematically by the institutions he had served. This is not ancient history. Waverly Woodson was alive in the 21st century. His family is alive now. The injustice is not some distant wrong from a bygone era. It is a living legacy, a continuing failure to make right a clear historical wrong. The men whose lives Waverly Woodson saved on D-Day went on to live full lives, to raise families, to contribute to their communities. Some became teachers or businessmen or workers in 1,000 different fields. Some undoubtedly led unremarkable lives, the kind that don't make history books. But they lived because a black medic from Philadelphia refused to let them die, because he crawled across a beach under machine gun fire to reach them, because he worked for 12 hours straight with shrapnel in his leg and blood soaking his uniform. How many children were born because Waverly Woodson saved their fathers? How many grandchildren, great-grandchildren, how many lives in the generations since D-Day exist because of what he did? The calculations are impossible, but the debt is real, and America has yet to pay it. There's a photograph of Waverly Woodson taken sometime in the 1990s. He's an elderly man in the picture, his hair white, his face lined with age. He is wearing his medals, the Grand Star, the Purple Heart, and the various service ribbons he earned during the war. He is not smiling, but his expression is calm, dignified. Looking at that photograph, knowing what he did and what he was denied, it is impossible not to feel a sense of profound injustice. This was a man who gave everything for his country, who displayed courage that defies comprehension, who saved hundreds of lives under the most horrific circumstances imaginable. And his country gave him a Bronze Star and then tried to forget he existed. The fight for Waverly Woodson's recognition continues. Bills are introduced in Congress. Historians write books and articles. Activists organize campaigns. His family refuses to let the story die. Perhaps someday justice will be done. Perhaps the Medal of Honor will finally be awarded, even if it must be given posthumously, even if Waverly Woodson himself never lived to see it. But even if that day comes, even if the medal is finally bestowed, it will not erase the 70-plus years of denial. It will not restore what was taken from him in life, the recognition, the respect, the acknowledgement that he had earned a place in the pantheon of American heroes. The best we can do now is remember. We can tell his story, ensure that his name is spoken alongside those of the other heroes of D-Day, insist that future generations know what he did and what was done to him. We can refuse to let America forget him again. On June 6, 1944, on a beach in Normandy, Waverly Bernard Woodson, Jr. saved more than 200 lives. He displayed courage, skill, and selfless dedication under the most extreme conditions of war. He embodied the highest ideals of military service and human compassion. He earned by any measure a place in history. That he was denied that place is America's shame, not his. That shame endures, a moral debt that compounds with every passing year, a reminder that the work of justice is never finished, that the promise of equality remains unfulfilled. Waverly Woodson is gone now, beyond the reach of medals or recognition or any earthly honor. But his story remains, a testament to both heroism and injustice, a challenge to every generation that comes after. We remember him. We must remember him. Because forgetting him again would be the final betrayal, the last and worst dishonor. And America has dishonored him enough.